In the spring of 1859, along the bayous of southwestern Louisiana, a sugar plantation known as Bellamont stood as a monument to wealth built upon human bondage. What transpired within its whitewashed walls would become a whispered legend, a scandal so profound that neighboring families would cease to speak the name Thornhill for generations. A colonel's obsession, an enslaved woman's cunning survival, and a child born into impossible circumstances would unravel one of the wealthiest estates in the parish, exposing the moral rot at the heart of Southern gentility. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, the tales that reveal what happens when power becomes absolute and humanity becomes property. Bellamont Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of fertile Louisiana soil, its fields thick with sugarcane that swayed like green oceans under the merciless summer sun. The estate belonged to Colonel Ashford Thornhill, a man of 47 years who had inherited both his father's land and his father's conviction that the Negro race existed solely for the enrichment of white civilization. Thornhill had studied briefly at the College of William and Mary before returning to Louisiana to expand his family's holdings. He was known throughout St. Martin Parish as a Methodist of stern principle, a man who kept his 234 enslaved workers under strict discipline, but prided himself on providing adequate rations and refusing to separate families at auction, a mercy he considered evidence of his Christian character. His wife, Constance Thornhill, née Beaumont, was the daughter of a New Orleans shipping magnate. At 39, she maintained the household with the cold efficiency expected of a plantation mistress, supervising the house servants with a ledger-like precision, her barren womb a source of private anguish that had transformed over 15 years of marriage into a kind of brittle acceptance. She attended church every Sunday, her silk dresses rustling with propriety, her face arranged in the perpetual half-smile of Southern feminine grace. The woman who would undo this carefully constructed world was called Céline, though the name had been given to her by a previous owner, not by the mother who had birthed her in a cramped cabin on a Mississippi River plantation 31 years earlier. Céline was what the Creoles called a quadroon, her skin the color of honey and sunlight, her features delicate enough that visitors to Bellamont sometimes mistook her for a paid servant rather than property. She worked in the main house as Constance Thornhill's personal maid, a position of relative privilege that nonetheless demanded absolute submission. Céline could read, having been taught in secret by a Presbyterian missionary's daughter years before, a dangerous knowledge she kept hidden like a knife beneath her tongue. She understood the rhythms of the great house, the patterns of the colonel's moods, the architecture of white power that surrounded her like invisible walls. Among the other enslaved workers, Céline was known for her careful reserve, her refusal to engage in the communal singing or the quiet rebellions that occasionally flickered through the quarters. She survived by making herself useful, indispensable, and nearly invisible. The households of Bellamont included others whose fates would become entangled in the coming tragedy. There was Marcus, a 52-year-old carpenter whose hands could coax beauty from raw cypress wood, a man who had watched his own children sold away 2 decades prior and now moved through life with the numb deliberation of the perpetually grieving. Sarah was a laundress of 26 who sang spirituals while she worked, her voice carrying across the yard like a prayer or a warning. Young Thomas, barely 17, worked in the stables with a defiant pride that worried the older enslaved workers who knew such pride could be beaten out of a boy or worse. Esther, ancient and half-blind, tended the kitchen garden and possessed a knowledge of roots and herbs that made her valuable despite her failing strength. Moses, the overseer's trusted assistant, was a man of 40 whose cooperation with white authority had earned him both small privileges and the contempt of his fellow sufferers. Dinah, a field hand of 23 with arms muscled from cutting cane, harbored a rage so carefully concealed that even her closest companions could not read it in her eyes. These were the witnesses to what was about to unfold, the chorus to a tragedy they could neither prevent nor escape. The transformation began in December of 1858, during the Christmas holiday when Colonel Thornhill traditionally distributed extra rations and permitted the enslaved workers a day of rest. Constance had taken ill with one of her recurring fevers and spent the week confined to her bedchamber, leaving the household management to Celine's capable hands. It was during this interval that the colonel, perhaps emboldened by bourbon and the vulnerability of finding himself in close proximity to a woman whose servitude made her powerless to refuse him, first approached Celine in the upstairs hallway. The encounter was brief. A hand on her arm, words spoken too softly for others to hear, a proposition disguised as kindness. Celine understood immediately the impossible calculus of her position. Refusal might mean the fields, the whip, or sail down the river to the brutal sugar plantations further south, where workers died within 7 years on average. Acceptance meant entering into a relationship that violated every public moral code of the South, while occurring with such frequency that everyone knew it and no one acknowledged it. She chose survival, as countless women had chosen before her, and in that choice became complicit in her own exploitation, a victim who would later be judged as a temptress. By March of 1859, Celine understood she was pregnant. She concealed the condition for as long as possible, letting out her dresses, binding her belly, moving carefully through her duties with the heightened caution of someone navigating a minefield. The colonel was aware, of course. He had been keeping count, watching her with a mixture of pride and apprehension that betrayed his understanding of the complications ahead. In the privacy of his study, away from his wife's hearing, he began to speak to Celine of arrangements, of provisions he might make, of a small house he could purchase in New Orleans, where she and the child might live in relative comfort under the fiction of her being a free woman of color. These were fantasies, of course, projections of a man attempting to reconcile the irreconcilable, to be both a Christian gentleman and a man who wielded absolute power over another human being's body. Pause for a moment and reflect on this particular evil, that a man could view himself as benevolent while trapping a woman in circumstances where consent was impossible, where every act of submission was coerced by the threat of violence or destitution. The language of love, of special favor, of mutual desire, was deployed to mask what was in essence legalized rape, a violation made respectable by its ubiquity. Constance Thornhill discovered the truth in May, when Celine's condition could no longer be hidden. The revelation came not through the colonel's confession, but through the observation of Margaret, an older house servant who had watched the situation develop with growing concern, and finally, motivated by some combination of loyalty to her mistress and perhaps her own complex resentments, informed Constance in the clipped, careful language that enslaved people used when delivering dangerous news to white authority. The mistress's response was volcanic in its cold precision. She did not weep or rage in the theatrical manner that novels of the period might suggest. Instead, she retreated to her private chambers for 3 days, during which she consulted with her father in New Orleans, via urgent correspondence, reviewed the plantation's financial records, and emerged with a plan that demonstrated both her fury and her formidable intelligence. Constance confronted her husband in his study on a Wednesday evening, the air thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas screaming in the live oaks outside. The conversation, reconstructed from the later testimony of Thomas, who had been trimming lamps in the adjacent hallway, was conducted in the flat tones of people who have moved beyond anger into something more dangerous. Constance did not demand that Celine be sold, as might have been expected. Instead, she proposed an arrangement so audacious, so calculated to preserve her own dignity while destroying her husband's peace, that it revealed the particular genius of revenge available to a woman with no legal power but considerable social leverage. She demanded that the child, if it survived birth, be acknowledged in writing as the colonel's offspring. More than that, she demanded that a portion of the plantation be set aside in trust for the child's future use, a legal arrangement that would require witnesses, documentation, and the involvement of the parish's most prominent attorney. The colonel, caught between his wife's ultimatum and his own tangled sense of honor, agreed. He told himself he was being generous, that he was doing right by his own blood regardless of the circumstances of its conception. He failed to understand, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, that his wife's plan was designed not to provide for the child, but to ensure that the scandal would become indelible public record, that the Thornhill name would be permanently stained, that every time the colonel attended church or conducted business in town, he would be reminded of his fall from grace. Constance had weaponized documentation itself, turning the tools of patriarchal power against the patriarch. The documents were drawn up by Ezra Whitfield, a prominent attorney in St. Martinville, who had handled the Thornhill family's legal affairs for 2 decades. Whitfield, a man of 60 with political ambitions that required maintaining the favor of wealthy planters, found himself in an impossible position. He could not refuse a client of the colonel's standing, yet he understood that drafting such papers would mark him as complicit in a profound social transgression. The will amendment and trust documents were written in the careful language of legal obfuscation, referring to a male child born to a household servant, and provisions for said child's education and maintenance, but everyone involved understood the implications. The papers were signed in June of 1859, with Marcus and Moses called in to serve as witnesses, 2 enslaved men required to place their marks on documents that demonstrated how thoroughly the color line could be violated while remaining legally intact. Celine gave birth on a sweltering August night, attended by Esther and a midwife from a neighboring plantation. The child was a boy, light-skinned but unmistakably Negro by the laws and customs of Louisiana, which held that 1 drop of African blood determined race absolutely. The colonel named him Ashford Thornhill, Jr., a designation so presumptuous that it caused audible gasps at the Baptist church the following Sunday when the birth was mentioned in the parish registry. Constance, maintaining her strategy of making the scandal as public and official as possible, insisted the child be baptized in the Thornhill family Bible, an act that simultaneously acknowledged the baby's paternity and ensured that the transgression would be recorded for posterity. If you find yourself drawn to these histories, to understanding how power corrupted and destroyed in the Old South, subscribe to Shadows of the South. These stories need to be told, remembered, and reckoned with. The white community's response was swift and merciless, though it followed the peculiar logic of Southern honor culture that punished public acknowledgement rather than private sin. Had the colonel simply kept Celine as a concubine, without documentation, without legal recognition, the arrangement would have been ignored with the same willful blindness that characterized the South's approach to widespread interracial sexual exploitation. But by putting the relationship into writing, by establishing the child as an heir, the colonel had violated the unwritten code that maintained white supremacy through the careful management of public performance. Other planters began to exclude the Thornhills from social gatherings. Invitations to the annual hunting parties and balls ceased. The Methodist pastor, Reverend Samuel Pierce, paid a private visit to Bellamont to express his concern, suggesting in language carefully calibrated to avoid direct confrontation that the colonel might consider a period of reflection and perhaps a generous donation to the church's mission fund. The social isolation drove Constance into a state of bitter triumph. She had succeeded in destroying her husband's reputation, but in doing so had also destroyed her own position in the community she had once commanded. She began to spend months at a time in New Orleans with her family, leaving the plantation's management increasingly in the hands of the overseer, a man named Dalton, who lacked the colonel's restraint and whose cruelties in the fields increased proportionally to the decline in supervision. The enslaved population of Bellamont watched these developments with a complex mixture of satisfaction at witnessing white power turn upon itself and dread at the deteriorating conditions of their own lives. Sarah's spirituals took on darker themes. Thomas, the stable hand, began to speak more openly of running north, dangerous talk that Moses felt obliged to report to the overseer, creating divisions within the slave quarters that had not existed before. As young Ashford grew from infant to toddler, his existence became a living accusation. Defernal kept him in the main house initially, an arrangement that Constance tolerated with icy silence, before eventually establishing Celine and the child in a separate cottage on the plantation grounds. This cottage became a kind of secondary household, neither fully enslaved quarters nor free home, existing in the legal and social limbo that characterized the South's racial caste system. The colonel visited daily, bringing gifts, insisting on personally teaching the boy his letters, projecting onto the child all the frustrated paternal ambitions that his barren marriage had denied him. He spoke of eventually sending young Ashford north for education, perhaps to France where racial distinctions were less rigid, of establishing him in business, of creating a life that would transcend the circumstances of his birth. These were delusions, of course, the fantasies of a man who had convinced himself that will and wealth could overcome the fundamental structures of slavery and white supremacy. In contemplating his son's future, the colonel failed to reckon with the reality that young Ashford was, in the eyes of Louisiana law and custom, still enslaved, still property that could theoretically be seized to satisfy debts or distributed as inheritance. The trust documents provided some protection, but they existed in tension with the basic legal fact that the child remained chattel, a contradiction that could only be sustained through the colonel's continued life and power. Pause here and consider the psychological torture of this arrangement for Celine, who was required to play the role of grateful mistress, to raise a child in proximity to the family that both claimed and rejected him, to navigate the impossible position of being neither wife nor mere servant, desired but despised, elevated but utterly vulnerable. What reserves of strength or dissociation must she have cultivated to survive each day? The situation's precariousness became catastrophically apparent in the fall of 1860, as the nation's political crisis moved toward war. South Carolina seceded in December, and Louisiana would follow in January of 1861. The colonel, swept up in the martial enthusiasm of the moment, announced his intention to raise and equip a company of infantry, a gesture that might restore his social standing by demonstrating his commitment to the Confederate cause. He would be leaving for military service, which meant leaving Celine and young Ashford vulnerable to whatever forces might emerge in his absence. In a final attempt to secure their safety, the colonel revised his will in March of 1861, before departing for the war, explicitly bequeathing to Ashford Thornhill Jr., natural son of the testator, a 200-acre parcel of Bellamont, and a sum of $10,000 to be held in trust until the child's 21st birthday. The will further stipulated that Celine was to be granted her freedom upon the colonel's death and provided with sufficient funds to maintain the household. These provisions, written in the law offices of St. Martinville and properly witnessed, represented both the colonel's attempt at justice and the final explosion of the family's destruction. Constance, upon learning of the will's contents, suffered what the doctor described as a complete nervous collapse. She was confined to her bed for weeks, attended by physicians who prescribed laudanum and bed rest, while she apparently muttered continuously about betrayal and disgrace. Her father arrived from New Orleans and initiated legal proceedings to have the will challenged on grounds of mental incapacity, arguing that no man in his right mind would dispossess his legitimate wife in favor of his slave mistress and bastard son. The colonel departed for war in April of 1861, leaving behind a plantation divided against itself, a legal battle over his will, an enslaved population aware that their world was about to change in ways they could neither predict nor control, and two women locked in a struggle over his legacy. He would be killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, shot through the chest while leading a charge across a Tennessee field, dying far from Louisiana and the chaos he had created. The news reached Bellamont 3 weeks later, carried by a soldier from the same company who had survived the battle. The plantation's response to the colonel's death followed the fault lines that had been developing for 3 years. Constance, emerging from her laudanum haze, moved immediately to secure her position, consulting with attorneys and her father's business associates to block the execution of the will's controversial provisions. Celine, suddenly aware that the protection of the colonel's living presence had been removed, withdrew into the cottage with young Ashford, now nearly 3 years old, and waited to see what forces would be unleashed. The legal battle consumed the remainder of 1862 and stretched into 1863. Louisiana courts, staffed by judges sympathetic to plantation families and deeply invested in maintaining racial hierarchies, even as the war made slavery's future uncertain, moved slowly on the case. The challenge hinged on whether the colonel had been of sound mind when revising his will, and whether a man could legally bequeath property to his own enslaved son. Witnesses were called, including several of the enslaved workers from Bellamont, who were questioned about the colonel's mental state and his relationship with Selene. These testimonies, extracted under circumstances that made free speech impossible, painted contradictory pictures. Marcus, the carpenter, stated under oath that the colonel had seemed perfectly rational. Moses, the overseer's assistant, suggested the colonel had been acting strangely, perhaps affected by the stress of impending war. The proceedings revealed the extent to which truth itself was a commodity that could be shaped by power. During this period, conditions at Bellamont deteriorated severely. With the colonel dead and Constance preoccupied with legal battles, the overseer Dalton assumed near total control of daily operations. His management was characterized by increasing brutality, by punishments meted out for minor infractions, by the kind of casual violence that the colonel's presence had somewhat restrained. Sarah, the laundress, received 20 lashes for singing while she worked, a punishment that left her back scarred and her spirit, according to those who knew her, permanently altered. Thomas, the stable hand, attempted to run away in the summer of 1862 and was caught by slave patrollers 10 miles north of the plantation. He was returned, publicly whipped, and fitted with an iron collar that he was forced to wear for 6 months. These punishments were designed to restore order in a world where white authority felt increasingly threatened by military defeats and rumors of federal emancipation. Selene, during this time, became a kind of ghost on the plantation. She ventured from the cottage only when necessary, aware that her position had transformed from privilege to profound vulnerability. The other enslaved workers viewed her with a mixture of sympathy and resentment. She had been the colonel's favorite, had lived in relative comfort while they suffered in the fields, and now she possessed a claim to land and money that most free white women could never imagine. Yet she was also trapped, unable to leave without abandoning her son, unable to defend herself against Constance's legal maneuvering, unable to call upon any community for support since she existed between worlds, belonging fully to none. The will contest was finally resolved in March of 1863, and the decision demonstrated the limits of paternal sentiment when confronted with legal precedent and social custom. The court ruled that while the colonel's will was valid in its general provisions, the specific bequests to young Ashford and the freedom grant to Selene were void on the grounds that one cannot legally bequeath property to property itself. The judge, in his written opinion, noted with evident discomfort that while the colonel's affection for his natural son was understandable, the law did not recognize such relationships as creating legitimate inheritance rights for Negro children. The 200-acre parcel and the $10,000 reverted to Constance as the colonel's legal widow and heir. Yet even in defeat, the colonel's intentions created complications. Constance, aware that simply continuing to hold Selene and young Ashford as slaves would invite further scandal and possibly violence from the enslaved population, chose a different path. She arranged for their sale, but not to the brutal plantations of the Deep South as might have been expected. Instead, she sold them to a free Negro tradesman in New Orleans, a man named Baptiste Fournier, who operated a carpentry shop and had accumulated enough wealth to purchase occasional slaves for his business. The sale price was nominal, suggesting that Constance's motivation was less profit than permanent removal of the living evidence of her husband's betrayal. The transaction was completed in April of 1863, and Selene and young Ashford were transported to New Orleans, vanishing from the plantation's records. The question of what this sale actually meant, given Fournier's status as a free person of color, has been debated by historians. Some evidence suggests that Fournier effectively freed Selene and her son immediately upon purchase,
a not uncommon practice among free Negroes who bought family members or others to remove them from slavery's harshest conditions. Other records suggest that Celine worked in Fournier's household for several years before receiving formal manumission papers. What is certain is that young Ashford survived the war, grew to adulthood in New Orleans, and eventually established himself as a schoolteacher in the city's free Negro community. He lived until 1907, dying at the age of 48 from tuberculosis, having married and fathered 3 children of his own. Whether he ever learned the full story of his origins, whether he knew about the legal battle over his inheritance, whether he understood that he had technically been the heir to 200 acres of Louisiana sugarland, remains unknown. Constance lived until 1879, maintaining control of what remained of Bellamont through the war's devastation, the collapse of slavery, and the chaotic violence of Reconstruction. The plantation never recovered its antebellum productivity. The sugar works were destroyed by federal troops in 1863. Most of the formerly enslaved workers departed immediately upon emancipation, scattering to New Orleans or northward, seeking family members sold away in earlier years, or simply putting distance between themselves and the site of their suffering. Marcus, the carpenter, died during a cholera outbreak in 1866. Sarah worked as a laundress in St. Martinville until her death in 1881. Thomas was never heard from after emancipation. Whether he finally made it north or died trying is unrecorded. Esther, the herb woman, remained on what was left of Bellamont, living in a cabin on the property until her death in 1870, tending a garden and occasionally selling remedies to neighbors. Moses disappeared from historical record entirely. Dinah married a blacksmith and raised 6 children in Baton Rouge. Constance herself became an increasingly isolated figure, known in her later years as the widow who haunted the decaying mansion, refusing to sell land even as the property fell into disrepair, maintaining the house with just a few paid servants. She attended the Methodist Church until near the end of her life, sitting in the same pew where she had once presided over the congregation's social hierarchy, now largely ignored by a community that had moved on to new scandals and new arrangements of power. When she died, the estate was divided among distant cousins, who sold off the property piecemeal. The main house burned in 1884, under circumstances that were never fully explained, possibly arson, possibly accident, possibly the deliberate destruction by someone who wanted to erase what the place represented. In the final accounting, what had the Colonel's passion and Constance's revenge accomplished? 3 lives destroyed at the center, dozens more damaged at the periphery, a family name made synonymous with scandal, and a fortune dissipated. Young Ashford survived and built a life, but he did so by erasing his connection to Bellamont, by constructing an identity that had no need for white paternity or the false promise of plantation inheritance. He understood, perhaps better than his father ever could have, that there was no redemption to be found in that world, no way to reconcile the affection of an enslaver with the brutality of enslavement itself. Reflect on this final truth, that slavery's evil lay not only in its physical cruelties, but in its psychological distortions, in the way it convinced men they could own other humans, and still consider themselves honorable, could rape women who had no power to refuse and call it romance, could create children with those they enslaved, and feel benevolent in making grudging provisions for them. The Colonel believed himself better than other masters, more enlightened, more willing to acknowledge his responsibilities. In truth, he was simply participating in a system that made monsters of otherwise ordinary people, that created situations where there were no good choices, only varying degrees of complicity and survival. The story of Bellamont Plantation stands as testimony to the particular destruction wrought when white male power met the absolute vulnerability of enslaved women, when the fiction of paternalism collided with the reality of property, when private acts became public scandals, not because the acts themselves were rare, but because someone dared to make them official. Across the South, thousands of similar arrangements existed in the shadows, acknowledged by everyone and officially recognized by no one. The difference in Louisiana in 1859 was that the colonel's attempt at honor, his effort to provide for his own blood, violated the unspoken agreement that kept the system functioning, that white supremacy required maintaining the public fiction of racial separation, even as private practice daily violated it. These stories, uncomfortable as they are, must be told because they reveal the true cost of slavery, which was measured not only in cotton bales and sugar harvests, but in shattered families, corrupted morals, and the kind of generational trauma that echoes through time. The South preferred to remember itself through the mythology of gentility, of mint juleps and magnolias, of noble causes and faithful servants, but the truth is found in places like Bellamont, in the lives of women like Saline, who survived by navigating impossible circumstances, in children like young Ashford, who carried the mark of their origins into uncertain futures, in the wreckage left behind when power is absolute and people are property. If these histories matter to you, if you believe we must confront the past honestly, rather than through comfortable nostalgia, leave your reflections below. The stories we uncover at Shadows of the South are not easy, but they are necessary. They remind us that the legacy of slavery was not a distant abstraction, but a concrete reality of human suffering and moral failure, the consequences of which shaped not only the 19th century, but the nation we inhabit today.